Hi, I'm Ruth, and I'm speaking from my studio, Get Quilts Done, which is also the name of my channel. And since I showed everybody or people that watched the video how to prepare a quilt, it is now time how to prepare binding. So I've got lots of examples of how I do my method, and I'm very happy to share it with you because it's taken me a long time to figure it out, and I wish I would have figured it out a long time ago. And I absolutely enjoy making the bindings since I started using this method. So let's get started. Okay, so let's begin by how we choose the fabric. And I always like to leave an important note here. Make sure you check out fabrics that you already own. There's a reason why we collect all these fabrics. And then afterwards, sometimes I go to the store with in mind buying binding for the future. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This fabric I just love. I used it in a quilt, and I've used it in this table runner, and this is what really started me on streamlining how I make the binding. I made it like this, and it's not that big of a difference. You could pick something like this, and it basically works for the many quilts that I made, and I really like it for binding. So when I was finished, I made a whole lot of it. And I really love this fabric in general, okay? And the same thing goes for this. This fabric is, I have it here. You could see it doesn't make that much of a difference. But there's sometimes when I buy fabric like this. Now this changes everything. I put it on the bias at home or at the store. I ask them to do it. I take a piece of fabric or a quilt or something solid, and I put it on top, and I see what it looks like. And in this case, it changes everything. It breaks up the pattern, and now I can use it for a bias binding, and I just love the effect. So there's some other material that has been in my house for many, many years. I think like 20 years. I must have been visiting England when with my husband, and I went into a quilting store, and I hadn't even moved to America yet. So let's see, I basically did the same thing. Okay, I go on the bias and see if it would make really nice binding, and there it is. It changes everything. I love it for the binding. All right, not a lot to say about this. I am ironing it. Just a few points. I do use heavy finish. Now, I don't always manage to get what I want to get, so I at least use this weight. I've never gotten this weight. Right now I'm here, as you can see the little arrow, but I do prefer to use something heavy. I don't know if I would go that heavy. And the reason is I'm cutting things on the bias, and I want things to be as stable as possible. So I just spray it, and this is already has the selvages cut off. I do cut off the selvages, and then I just iron away. So I bought this material. It's different material that I showed you before when I was ironing. I bought this material in order to make binding, but I bought extra. I would do it this way if I was going to make a queen size quilt and I wanted extra. I would literally make a triangle going all the way up. I've cut off the selvages and I've cut off the bottom parts, and I make the triangle as big as I want. And you can see it goes up pretty far, and I would have a strip right there. If you can bring the camera in right around here, you can see there's a strip and it's kind of going the other way. All right, but that's not what I plan on doing. I want to make one square that is 36 inches, 1 yard all the way around. And I'm going to use the side of this cutting board. Now this cutting board is old and not big enough, but I have a dream table I want to get just for cutting, and until I get it, that's when I will get a larger board. And a little bit of note, if you're waiting to get something because of funds or you haven't shopped for it and you haven't decided, go ahead and use what you have, okay? Get by. But I am going to use the measurements of about 36 inches. They say not to use the measurements of a cutting board. I agree. When you're doing small little triangles or squares and you're trying to make it into a perfect size 12-inch block or 9-inch block or whatever you're doing. But for something like this that I'm making a long strip of it, it's important that the strip will be 2.5 inches wide and folded 1 inch and 1¼ inch. But for what I'm doing now, 36, it doesn't have to be exact. So I'm going to take it right like this, and you can see I'm moving it, the triangle, and I'm smoothing it out just like that, okay? And this is going to be where I'm going to cut. And it's going to be about a yard. That'll make about 500 inches long. That's a lot of binding, and it'll give me a little bit of extra because I really love this material. I love it. I'm going to use little pieces of it. Now, I have a great big square that is really hard to fit, and I'm going to use this square just to do an estimate. It's really clumsy, hard to store, but I love this square anyways. Okay, so I use it just like this. It doesn't have to be exact. I can see that for some reason this side I didn't do a good job of cutting off the selvages. It does not matter. I'm just doing an estimate that everything is square and the way I want it to be. Okay, so I'm going to cut that piece now. Okay, so and just the regular cutting. Like I said, I'm not worried about total exactness. I do want it to be straight. You can use a good old-fashioned scissors if you want. And there is going to be logic in this when you see the square being made and how it goes along. And I'm going to have lots of binding and lots of extra pieces of binding and things to do. I'm going up, and the reason why I'm not using a square to finish this is it's very clumsy. I do use it a lot, but I try to use smaller things when I can. Okay, and I'm just cutting it just like that. I don't try not to cut and ruin my wonderful table, okay, that I have so far. All right, so both sides are done, and now I'm going to do this strip right here, okay? So I'm just going to turn it because I don't have my dream table and my dream cutting board yet, okay? But I am just turning it, and you can see just by eyeing it on this, yeah, that it's going to work out to be about the same size. Now, like I said, I could do a lot of different methods, but I like to use my rotary cutter as much as possible, and this is one of them. I do use the scissors for part of this, and you'll see in the continuation. Okay, and I just move it along, knowing that it would be it's going to be a lot easier when I finally get my big, another dream table. This one is also a wonderful table. Okay, so you can see it's a square, and sometimes if it doesn't match up to be a square, if I can show you right here, it's not really matching up to be a square, so I might just cut it down just a bit, and it'll cut down just both of them, okay? And to cut it on the upper one, I'm going to have to cut it. You see, it's not a perfect square because I didn't do it. Don't worry, it's not going to be as inexact, like I said, as you're doing the block. So, cut off the rest of it. And now I'm going to open it up, and it's going to be a square. Remember, it's going to be on the bias and when it's all done, but for right now it's not, and it is a square. You can see it is a wonderful square. So now it is time to manipulate the block or the square and turn into a parallelogram. Now what you're looking at is actually a smaller one, so it's easier to take a picture of it or take a video of it. The real big thing is that this was made just by, and you'll see on the screen a little bit, by using my very big block that is a 20.5-inch square. Now you can do a lot of those instead of doing the more difficult way of making a big block, but if you are doing a large quilt with it, or several large quilts, you're going to have a lot more seams, and they're more likely to get into the corners. So if you're going to do this simple way and just use a great big block, it's fine for small projects. And the reason why I'm showing you this fabric is it's a little bit easier to show how I'm doing things on using this. But here on in, once you've made the square, the process that I'm showing you is the same for a big square or a small square. It's the same thing. So let's begin. It is a square, and I have to turn it into a parallelogram, and I'll show you the difference. A square has 4 right angles that equal to 360. Parallelogram has 4 points, and it still equals 360, but it's a little different. So let's make it into it. I fold it in half like this. Okay, and remember, you're not making tiny little triangles and squares and all different shapes to fit into a perfect block. So you don't have to worry about that kind of perfection. There's several ways of doing this. You can either cut it, that's one way, and I do an easier method, which I think is an easier method, and I just trim it down with my finger, or you can use an actual tool to do it. Okay, and you can see this is the outside showing, okay, and that's really important in the continuation. Now, I take a ruler and I get as close as possible to the edge. So if you could bring it in, it's like a millimeter. A millimeter is less than 1/8 of an inch. I'm just cutting it off really, really close. So if you bring the camera in straight in, you can see this tiny edge here, okay? You can see the tiny edge. And after I cut it, I'll show you, it's so small. And of course, you would never cut a triangle for a block this way, okay? But for something like this, of course you can. So when you're working with bigger things that aren't fitting into a block, a lot of the really careful rules that you follow, you don't have to, okay? So here I am, I'm just cutting it down, and I'm not worried about over exactness because it is going to just not matter that much, okay? Okay. And of course I move it if I have to, like we always do. We move things around. We don't have to be afraid to. And especially like this because it's not that exact. And I'm going to show you how tiny these this edges that I've cut off in just a bit. So if I was to put it right here on this ruler, see the 1/4 inch? It's not even 1/8 of an inch. It's so tiny, okay? Now, I open it up, okay? And if I didn't manage to cut it all the way, I just make do, but I did. So we have the square, okay? And it's in 2 pieces. So, and you can see here, I didn't quite cut it all the way, no worries. Like I said, it's not that exact. Okay. and we have the square. Now, this is marbled fabric, and as you can see, I like using marbled fabric or hand dyes for binding, but I chose this because you can see what I'm doing better because of it. So these are the long sides. These are the two long sides, and we want to meet up these short sides to make it a parallelogram. So I turn one counterclockwise, and I turn the other one clockwise, and it doesn't work, and I turn it all the way till I get to it does. And there you go. So you see I have a parallelogram but not a square. These two sides are parallel and these two sides are parallel. All right? And these two sides are what we call the long sides. So we have to sew them together. Okay? And this is going to be the seam, and I do a 1/4 inch seam right there. So let's get going. There we go. I turn it over, and this is why I chose this fabric to do the demo on, because it's easier to see what's going on. I've just turned this and I'm matching up these seams like that, and if I didn't cut that well, like right here, I'll just trim it down. It's not a big deal. And it's about 3/8 of an inch that this tail goes over. You could kind of eye it if you want, no big deal. Okay, and I do use quite a few pins on this, and I get it together. But what's really important is that you look at the top piece has the wrong side up, and the bottom piece has the top side up, and it looks like kind of like a flag or something like that before I open it up. So already things are kind of awkward, but we're used to doing awkward kind of things when we sew, right? Because we do a lot, we press in a lot of triangles and things like this, but it gets even more awkward as time goes on. But in order to keep it all together, when I move it to the sewing machine, I do use pins. And it's really important that you understand how it looks as we're going along. There is going to be an aha moment where everything works out, and you'll see why I do this. And I call it streamlining, even though it seems like a lot of work, it's actually streamlining it. And I will have several lengths of binding to choose from, and it really makes a difference when I sew. It really adds to things. I'm getting ready to sew, and as usual, I take a look at my screen on my sewing machine. And before I had the Bernina 770, I had a different Bernina, and it wasn't computerized, but I did change around the throat plate or the stitch plate quite a bit. So I don't do it every time I have a session because nothing's going to happen, but I got in the habit of checking to make sure that it says what the stitch plate is. Now, if you don't have a computerized one and you're changing around the stitch plate, I would use a sticky note to remind me. So now I have it in the machine, and sure enough, 9mm is the same, and you'll see a picture flash up. It's the 9mm stitch plate, and I do use it even though I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'll show you why. I go over to my stitch that I'm going to use and to the quilting section. I use the 1326, and it's, let me get it in here. There it is, and you can see it's already set up. I've done other lessons. I might just do a whole lesson just how to program this, but it's already in the memory. I have written down in a small journal that I keep a list of instructions and where I want the needle to be and what stitches I use, and I use them regularly. If you have a different machine, you could use a different method. I'm going to show you this. I really like doing what I do using this method. I do have this in the temporary memory because I'm going to be using it for a while. Just about always when I sew on the binding, I use the 4. but I use the regular stitch length, which is 2.0. The reason I'm using, I'm going to clear it, and I'm going to use the smaller one. The reason why I'm using the smaller one is I am, the smaller stitch length that is, I'm going to be cutting across the seams, and I need the stitch length to be shorter so it's less likely to fray. And that's really important. And the 4 I'm going to show you because that's the foot I'm using. This machine hasn't gotten the upgrade yet. It's something I really want. I am using the 34D foot, and I heard from somebody that you should always press it, even though it'll press it and it'll tell you I'm using something else. It'll just give you the instructions, but it won't show up here. It'll still say 1D. And the D, just to remind you, means there's this top bar that is pulling the top thread along with the bottom. And that's really useful. And I'm going to show you why I'm using both of them. The other thing is, if you have a Bernina machine that does these things, I have this 770 and I just love it. I go in and change a few things. So I am stitching, I am using pins, but I'm going to be taking them out as I go. So the hover foot, and that's what I'm pressing right now, is going to stay there. So it doesn't go up. You see, when the needle goes down, it's not going to go up like in the middle. The next section I actually am going to use the hover foot, but not for this section. Okay, and let me get into that. I got all the way out. I didn't mean to. So the next thing that I'm going to do is how I knot it, because that's also really important. So when I cut the scissors at the end, if I'm doing a straight line, I don't want this group of 4. If I'm sewing in a straight line and I'm not doing applique, I want to go here. I pretty much keep it at 4, not a big deal. And so I have to actually press that button. It knots it, has 4 little stitches at the end. And that's it for setting it up. I actually don't even need to have the 4 little stitches at the end because it's so short, but I just keep it there because when I get to the end, that's the way I always work. And now everything is set up, and of course the needle, I like it to stop when I stop the machine. You know, as we move the fabric along, I like the needle to be down. Here we go. I'm actually getting to sew. I want to show you a few things and how I got to the number 4 going of the needle space of 4 to the right. I think I said that right. So first off, the reason why I'm using this foot versus the 97D foot is the 97D foot doesn't cover all of the feed dogs. And that's fine when I'm doing tiny little pieces, but for longer pieces, I prefer it to be, I prefer to use this foot, and move it over. Also, this foot is beautiful for a scant seam. I find that I'm better off using this one and finding the perfect 1/4 inch. Now, to remind you, the scant seam, 1/4 inch scant seam, means that it includes the thread as part of the seam. That's how exact it has to be. Now, I don't want to use that small one because I'm going to be pressing it open. I don't need that kind of exactness, and it's easier to press open to grab a hold of the fibers to press the seam open. Okay, so I have an ideal seam gauge. I think that there's other ones. I'll leave a link to it. And basically, I messed around with it. I went to the 1/4 inch, and I moved it. I put it in each time, so about where the needle is, and then I made sure it matched up right here. So it's kind of hard to explain, but if I put the foot down and I manually put it in to the hole, you can see that it lines up flush with the edge of this foot. Okay, and that's just what I wanted. Okay, that's just what I wanted it to do. So when I experimented going around it, this is what worked. After a while, you get a feel for it. So that's just really quick what I did. and I'll leave a link for it. It should be in every quilter's bag of notions, in my opinion. And then I just sew, okay? And like I said, remember the dual feed. If you don't have the 34D foot, you can use the 1D foot or the 1C foot. But I would recommend getting this. It is clear, and that makes it really much easier to judge where the fabric is, especially when I'm sewing on the binding. Having it being clear is really a nice asset. So we just get started and we sew. All right, and now it does take a bit more time because you're using a smaller stitch. And that's just the way it's going to have to work. This, of course, is not only do I not have my magnifying glass, I have my camera right in here. So both of those together makes it really difficult, but okay. And I'm just going to take out the pins as I go. Here you go. We're on to the next stage. Simple stage. We're just basically ironing this open. You could just use your fingers. Sometimes I think that's the easiest way to do it. Not worrying about pressing. I just iron it just to smooth it along. And then I turn it over and I make sure that it's done well on the other side. On that side, I usually use the idea of pressing. So making sure I don't pull too tight and try to open it the most. It doesn't matter. Okay, you could see there's a little bit of imperfection over there. That doesn't matter. I'm not making a little block. Okay, now I turn it over again, and I want you to notice that we have two long ends and two short ends, okay? And that's really important, okay? Because we are going to start, I think, like either way you pull it, here's the long end, and short end, okay? You can see how it works out. So what I do is I start to mark it 2.5 inches. I have a pencil that I use, and I have a special ruler, and just like the mat that I bought too small, I actually bought this too small. I am changing it out this year for an 18-inch, but it has to be 2.5 inches wide. Okay, and I just start to measure it. Now, when you mark with this, what's really important, besides it being the right size, is that you use a good pencil. You don't want to use something that's chalk-based that will go off really easily, because you're going to be handling it a lot. It means that you might not have markings where you want markings. And it really doesn't matter, this little edge. Nobody will see it. It goes deep inside of the quilt when it's finished. It won't see it. So I don't worry about it. This is a 2B pencil. And I just begin to mark. Okay, and you can see the end piece is a little bit small. It's just an extra piece of binding, part of the binding that'll come out, and you could do what you want with it. I usually just throw it away. There you go. Now we're going to go on to the next part, and it's a little bit difficult to see or to make an example of. So I'm a big fan of shears, but I'm not going to use shears for this. I have to go at the pointy side. You can see how this side is not as pointy. I'm going to go on the pointy side, making sure that it's not the smaller piece over there, making sure I'm not doing it there. I'm doing it here where it's first 2.5, and I'm going to cut it. Okay, just like that. You don't have to cut it that far, just 4 or 5 inches. And I also do 1/4 inch, and I do a scant 1/4 inch because I want to sew right on there. I forgot to do that. I do 1/4 inch, and it only has to cross the lines. So here it is, scant. So I put the line a little bit past where the material stops. So it's scant, so it's a little bit smaller. And every little line has to cross, and I'll show you why when I pin it together. So here I am doing it on both sides. Okay, and I forgot to mention, I always trim all this stuff because it's just easier to work with when I don't have those sticking out. So I match up. It's easier the first one if you skip. You see how this part is hanging loose? You match up right where the X is. Okay, right in the middle, I put in a needle, or I'm not a needle. I put in a pin. Okay, let me get this again. Okay. So you go to the second one because the first one is already cut, and there will be logic when we get that far. There's going to be logic for this. Trust me. Okay. So you put in a pin right in the middle of the X, and then you put in a pin right in the middle of the X. You can see that right there. Okay, and it is matched up, and you have your markings are helping you because this is so wonky it's hard to tell without the markings. Okay, so that's the first one, and I pin around each one. Okay, and to make sure it stays right, I pin on both sides, and then I go to the next one, and it works its way down all the way till I'm done. And like I said, this is very uncomfortable to work with, especially because it's smaller. And if you're doing a bigger square, which I usually do, it's quite a lot, quite a few of them, and you can feel how you're making something really big going on, so you're going to have lots of bias. This will have quite a bit, but not as much as I usually make. So we get to the end here, and it should work fairly well. I'm not that worried about it if it doesn't, because as long as these do, make sure that it's kind of wonky, but that it looks like it's something. Okay, see how this one starts, and I go to the beginning, and I redo that one. I set this one up, okay, and this mark here should fall right in place of what I'm doing. I don't stretch it too much. Okay. And if it was to open up, it's going to look like that, kind of like that in the inside. But see how it's wonky? It doesn't really fit that well. And this side is kind of problematic. I'm not really that worried about it because it's the end of it. Okay, sometimes things just have to work that way. Okay. Okay, so we're just looking at the part right before we move it to the machine. And so you could see at one end we have a little bit of extra. So this is 2.5 inches and this isn't. That's the extra end. And I usually pin it. You can also cut it beforehand and trim the sharp end. But I like to do it this way. So I have that bit. That way it's more exact. It's easier to match up. And I just trim it right down. And when it gets to the other side, I take out some of the pins. So I'm just cutting it, and like I said, it's wonky, so you want to be really careful when you do it. Put your hand underneath and make sure that you're only cutting the one strip. Just be very careful going across, and you can see what the finished product looks like. It's just a little bit less wide. It happens to be wide enough that I can use it. You see right there on the screen, there's a seam on it. So because it's at the edge and we just cut across the seams, I just cut it off. In this case, I can actually use this bias since I'm doing art quilts. If it's too narrow, I can't. I don't fold it. I usually prefer to fold my bias strips, but because this one is out of the ordinary, I don't want to get it mixed up with something else, so I leave it flat. So I know right away that it's not the regular size of 2.5 inches that I want to make a standard size that I use. I have made that mistake before, and it caused me a lot of strife, as you can imagine. So right here you can see that that edge needs to be clipped. Okay, so I take out some of the scissors, and it's the top part that I hadn't clipped yet, the pointy side. You can take off the extra bit first and then cut it so you have both edges before you even work. But you could see right here, I'm just cutting across it, and of course, always be careful because things are wonky, okay? So you only want to cut that strip. That's really important. Okay, so I lay it out, and I'm going to pull the camera out so you can see right there, you can see both edges how it works. Those lines will line up after it's sewn together. The pins are keeping it from looking the way it is. I will show it to you after it's sewn that it works out to be perfectly lined up, and we can cut across all the seams. The reason you're looking at the screen again is I am making changes. You don't have to look at the screen every time you sit down at the machine if you're in the same session and if you're using the same stitch, which I'm doing in the same foot. Everything stays the same, but I am making one small change, and that is the hover foot. Because I'm using a lot more pins, when I did the first seam, I didn't have to, and I took them out as I went. But this, I'm going to let them get a lot closer because I actually matched up lines using a pin. So I'm going to be keeping them in for a little bit longer. So to make my life easier, I am going to go back to the utility stitches, go right here to where the needle is down, and you can see the hover foot. Well, the needle is down. Now you see the hover foot. You see where it was before. When I'm doing a long stretch, I don't need it. This is where it's going now. If I was doing a lot of turns and weaving in and out, then I might use the highest one. But for this, for our purpose, I'm just doing it like just right there. And I find it's much easier if this gets a little bit too close, or if I accidentally go over a pin, which I do sometimes, and I've never had any problems doing that. If it gets a little close, I find it's easier to take out the pin. And that's it. I'm back to where I'm supposed to be. It's the same stitch length, it's the same foot I'm using, and the needle is to the right number 4. Okay, let's go to the next part and let's start to sew. So here I am going and I'm sewing. I'm making sure the side is flush right there. And when you see, the hover foot will be in action. See how it picks up and I can just get it out of the way. Now these little tiny white pins are there because I ran out of my favorite ones, so it looks like I'm going to have to buy more since I like them so much. So I'm going to sew along. I get to this section and I leave them in a little longer. I'm basically doing the same thing when I did the other one, but because I'm matching things up, it's so important that I keep the pins in a little bit longer, and the hover foot goes up and it's down. As soon as I start to sew, it goes down, and I can rearrange the material this way and make sure everything is going along and it's staying where it's supposed to be. It's just so important now because I want those lines to match up. What we're looking at is 2 pieces, one much smaller. One was a 20.5 inches, a little bit smaller maybe, and this one is 36 inches square that I started with. So, or maybe even a little bit bigger, but you could see it's going to make a lot more, and the seams are together. But once you make that square and you get into the next stage, you can see you're making the same thing. Now, if you want to make more narrow or more wider, it's the same system. And all I'm going to do next is I'm going to open up and these seams, I'm not opening them up, I'm going to press them open on both of these pieces. So with the blue one, because it has an inside out, because it's not hand dyed, you can see a lot better and see how the lines match up. And that's what we're looking for. That makes it a lot easier. You don't have to redo things. And that's why it's important to use a classic pencil like I do, something that doesn't wear off so easily, or you don't get rid of it because of heat. That's really important because you're going to be ironing this section flat. Like I do. Right now, just gonna use this. And the other one, it's really hard to see, but it looks just the same. Everything lines up and you press it just like this. You can see how easy it is going to be to cut it. All right, so what are you looking at now? See this? I make sure nothing's underneath it. Make sure it's straight on, and I get going. Now this is the part, if you want to, I recommend, of course, you can, once you get used to it, listen to music or a podcast or an old movie. You could always be quiet, but it doesn't take a lot of thinking, and it takes quite a while. On this little piece it doesn't. On the other piece it'll take quite a bit. And I'll just get going and show you. There you go. I don't even use a shears for this. I use a bigger scissors. If I'm cutting a lot like this, like the bigger one, I can resort to using gloves. And I use my basic gloves that I use for free motion quilting. It just makes it a little bit softer on my hands. If you have something a little bit more ergonomic, but I love these scissors, so I just find that gloves is enough. the last part. I just am folding them over so it's easier to sew. I don't do a really strong crease. And what I'm showing you here is it's not so important for this because there's a wrong side and a right side to this fabric. So we know that we fold it so that the right side is out. It's not a problem. But when you're doing fabric like this, that there is no clear right or wrong side that you have going on here, or if there is it's hard to tell. I start right where the seams are. That's where I start, and then I work back on myself and go forward. And the reason is that I don't want to start putting something like ironing something and then find out that I've gone the wrong way. I'm using a wool mat. I will leave a link to it. One of the many advantages of this, it clings to the fabric, so I tend to iron more than I press, and this solves that problem for me. I enjoy using it, and I would recommend using it for everybody. Well, here's the lineup. I'm hoping to have a large stash just of bias strips to use for bindings. I actually made 4, not 3, and I'm going to make more. Before I forget, I want to remind you to subscribe because I'm going to show 3 different ways of using the bias strips for bindings in the future, and I can't wait to show you that. Also, like it and leave some comments if you would like. I will try to get back to people. Okay, we're at the end, or at least of this part of making binding. Soon we're going to learn how to apply it. Using this method of making it and making it 2.5 inches and having it folded down to 1.25 inches, I use 3 different methods for applying it, and I love it. And even the last one, I'll have a little bonus section to add an extra layer for those who are interested. I've enjoyed this so much. It's changed everything, and I hope that it really helps everybody else. So as I've been saying several times in these videos, that we worry about color and the stitching to the very end of making the quilt. Not forgetting, just throwing on the binding and forgetting about it, making the binding the final beautiful touch that it's meant to be. Thank you. Bye.